Sometimes love comes when you least expect it, and sometimes it takes a lifetime to find the courage to open your heart again. In a world where duty matters more than desire, two souls are about to discover that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. Lord Kael is an ancient vampire who hasn't felt anything in 800 years. Lady Elira is a 50-year-old healer who thinks her time for love has passed. Their marriage is just politics, a way to stop a war between vampires and humans. Neither wants romance. Both have given up on love. But when a winter storm traps them alone in a mountain castle, something unexpected begins to happen. 7 days of snow and silence might just thaw two frozen hearts. Can a love that blooms late in life be the strongest love of all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Ravencrest Cathedral like memories that refuse to fade. Lady Elira Thornwick stood before the altar, her fingers tracing the worn silver of her healing satchel, a leather bag that had been her constant companion through decades of tending to the sick and wounded across the kingdom of Voldris. The satchel contained more than herbs and remedies. It held the essence of who she had become after losing her first husband 28 years ago. Every vial of lavender oil, every carefully pressed leaf, every small knife for gathering medicinal roots told the story of a woman who had chosen service over sorrow. At 53, Elira possessed the kind of beauty that comes not from youth, but from wisdom earned through hardship. Silver streaked through her chestnut hair like winter frost onto autumn leaves, and her green eyes held depths that spoke of countless nights spent at bedsides, holding hands of the dying and celebrating with new mothers. Her face bore the gentle lines of someone who had smiled more than she had wept, despite the grief that had shaped her early years. Today, she wore a gown of deep burgundy wool, elegant but practical, befitting a woman who valued substance over appearance. The dress had been her grandmother's, altered to fit her fuller figure, and she had chosen it deliberately. This marriage was not about beauty or youth. It was about alliance, wisdom, and the hope that two mature souls might find companionship in duty. Lord Kael Aldrich entered the cathedral like winter itself had taken human form. 8 centuries of existence had carved his features into something both beautiful and terrible. Sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, eyes the color of storm clouds, and skin pale as moonlight on snow. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of a predator who had never known weakness. He wore black leather and midnight blue silk, and a silver circlet rested upon his brow, ancient symbols of his authority over the vampire clans of the northern reaches. But it was his eyes that told the true story. They held the emptiness of someone who had lived too long and felt too little. For 800 years, Lord Kael had ruled his domain with calculated precision, his heart as frozen as the mountain peaks that surrounded his fortress. He had seen empires rise and fall, had watched mortal lives flicker and die like candles in the wind, and somewhere in those endless decades, he had simply stopped feeling anything at all. The war between his vampire clans and the human nobility had raged for 30 years, born from old grievances and sustained by mutual fear. Vampire lords needed human territories for their survival, while human nobles feared the immortal hunger that threatened their people. Blood had been spilled on both sides, and the land itself seemed weary of conflict. Elira's lineage offered something precious, a bridge between worlds. Her family had served as healers to both human and supernatural beings for generations, earning respect across all boundaries. Her late husband had been a minor lord whose lands bordered vampire territory, and their marriage had brought peace to that region for nearly 3 decades. Now, with her wisdom and Kael's power combined, there was hope for a lasting treaty. Archbishop Morwyn, a man whose beard had grown white in service to peace, cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His words carried the weight of tradition and the desperate hope of a kingdom exhausted by war. The cathedral filled with representatives from both sides, human lords in their finest court attire, vampire nobles whose pale beauty seemed almost ethereal in the colored light filtering through stained glass windows. "We gather today not merely to witness a union," the archbishop intoned, his voice echoing off ancient stones, "but to celebrate the binding of 2 souls in service to peace. May this marriage bring an end to bloodshed and usher in an age of understanding between our peoples." Kael's expression remained unchanged as he spoke his vows, each word precise and emotionless. "I, Kael Aldrich, Lord of the Northern Reaches, take thee, Elira Thornwick, as my wife. I pledge my protection, my resources, and my alliance. This union shall serve the greater good of our lands and peoples." When Elira spoke, her voice carried the warmth that his lacked. "I, Elira Thornwick, accept this bond with Lord Kael Aldrich. I bring to this marriage my knowledge, my compassion, and my commitment to healing the wounds between our peoples. May we find in duty what others find in love, and may our union bring peace to generations yet unborn." The rings they exchanged told their own story. Kael's was a heavy band of white gold, set with a black diamond, ancient, powerful, and cold. Elira's was simpler, a silver band with a small emerald that had belonged to her grandmother. When Kael slipped it onto her finger, she noticed his touch was indeed as cold as legend claimed, but she also noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the first crack in his perfectly composed facade. The ceremony concluded with the traditional blessing, but as the guests moved toward the great hall for the wedding feast, Elira found herself studying her new husband. There was something in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a flash of what might have been longing, quickly buried beneath centuries of practiced indifference. The feast that followed was elaborate but restrained, fitting the political nature of their union. Vampire nobles sat alongside human lords, and if the conversation was carefully diplomatic rather than warm, at least it was peaceful. Wine flowed, though Kael barely touched his goblet, and musicians played melodies that bridged the musical traditions of both cultures. Elira found herself seated beside her husband at the high table, aware that every eye in the hall watched their interactions. She had expected coldness, perhaps even disdain. But what she found was something more complex. When she spoke to him of her work as a healer, she caught glimpses of genuine interest. When she mentioned a particularly difficult case involving a vampire who had been poisoned by silver, she saw him lean slightly forward, engaged despite himself. "You treated one of my kind?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Lord Matthias of the Eastern Valley," she replied, cutting her meat with steady hands. He had been wounded in a skirmish, and the silver was working its way toward his heart. It took 3 days to extract every fragment. I know Matthias. He never mentioned how he survived. Kael's storm-grey eyes studied her with new attention. Silver poisoning is usually fatal to our kind. Not if you understand how it spreads through vampire physiology, Elira said matter-of-factly. The key is working quickly but carefully, and knowing which herbs can slow the poisoning while you work. For the first time since entering the cathedral, something flickered across Kael's features. Surprise? Perhaps even respect. You speak as if treating vampires is commonplace for you. Pain is pain, my lord. Suffering knows no boundaries between species. She met his eyes steadily. I became a healer because I believe in easing suffering wherever I find it. The conversation was interrupted by toasts and speeches from various dignitaries, each emphasizing the political importance of their union. Through it all, Elira remained gracious and composed, while Kyle maintained his aloof dignity. But she began to notice small things, the way he ensured her wine cup never emptied, how he slightly angled his body to shield her from the more boisterous guests, the careful attention he paid to her comfort despite his apparent emotional distance. As the evening progressed, talk turned to their departure for Winterhold Castle, an ancient estate high in the mountains that would serve as their honeymoon retreat. The castle had been neutral territory for centuries, belonging to neither vampire nor human nobility, and its remote location would give them privacy to establish their new dynamic without the scrutiny of court politics. The journey will take 2 days, Kyle informed her, as the feast began to wind down. I've arranged for a carriage and guards for your comfort. The castle is well provisioned, but if there are specific items you require for your healing work, they can be loaded tonight. His consideration touched her, though his tone remained formal. Thank you. I would like to bring some of my herb stores and medical instruments. One never knows what circumstances might arise. Of course. He paused, and for a moment seemed to struggle with something before adding, I should warn you that Winterhold can be isolated. The mountain weather is unpredictable, and we may find ourselves cut off from the outside world for extended periods. Elira studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. Does that prospect concern you, my lord? Kyle turned to meet her gaze, and in that moment she saw past his careful composure to something raw and uncertain underneath. I have grown accustomed to solitude, Lady Elira. I am not certain I remember how to be companionable. The honesty in his admission surprised them both. Elira felt something shift in her chest, not the giddy flutter of youth, but something deeper and more substantial. Here was a man who had lived for centuries, yet seemed somehow lost, carrying burdens she could only imagine. Perhaps, she said gently, we might learn together. I, too, have grown used to my own company these past decades, but I believe 2 people of goodwill can find a way to share space without discomfort. Something in Cale's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You are not what I expected, Lady Elira. What did you expect? Fear, perhaps. Resentment at being bound to a creature like me for political purposes. Most humans find my presence unsettling. Elira considered this, taking a sip of wine before responding. I won't pretend I'm not nervous about this arrangement. But fear? No. I've seen enough of the world to know that monsters are rarely the ones we're told to fear, and kindness can exist in the most unexpected places. As the guests began to depart and the great hall slowly emptied, Elira and Cale found themselves walking side by side toward their separate chambers, a concession to propriety that would end tomorrow when they departed for Winterhold. The castle corridors were lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows on stone walls, and their footsteps echoed softly in the silence. Lady Elira, Kyle said, as they reached the corridor that led to her chambers, I want you to know that I will honor the terms of our arrangement. You will have my protection and my respect, and I will make no demands upon you beyond what duty requires. She turned to face him fully, studying the way the torchlight played across his sharp features. And what do you believe duty requires of us, Lord Kale? Public unity. Private civility. Nothing more intimate than necessary for political appearances. His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the slight emphasis on the word intimate, as if the very concept made him uncomfortable. I see. Elira nodded slowly. And what if we find ourselves becoming something more than civil? What if proximity breeds genuine affection? Would that be permissible under your terms? Kyle's pause stretched long enough that she wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Lady Elira, I haven't felt genuine affection for anything in over 3 centuries. I would not wish to disappoint you with false hopes of something I may no longer be capable of providing. The sadness in his admission struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man who had lived so long that he had forgotten how to feel, yet something in his manner suggested he mourned that loss more than he would ever admit. My lord, she said softly, I ask for nothing but honesty between us. Whatever develops, or doesn't develop, let it be real. I've had my share of false promises and empty gestures. If we are to be bound together, let it at least be built on truth. Kyle studied her face in the flickering light, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure slipped entirely. What she saw in his eyes was not the ancient vampire lord of legend, but simply a man who had been alone too long and forgotten how to hope. Truth, he repeated, as if testing the word. Very well, Lady Elira. I will give you truth, though I fear you may find it colder than you expect. I am not afraid of cold, my lord. I have learned to find warmth in unexpected places. As she turned to enter her chambers, she heard him speak once more, so softly she almost missed it. Good night, Elira. Not Lady Elira, as protocol demanded, but simply her name, spoken with something that might have been tenderness. She paused in her doorway, looking back to find him still standing in the corridor, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Good night, Kyle. And as she closed the door behind her, Elira found herself wondering if perhaps this marriage of convenience might become something neither of them had dared to expect. Outside her window, snow began to fall, the first sign of the winter that would soon envelop Winterhold Castle and the 2 souls who would seek shelter within its ancient walls. The storm lantern swayed gently from its hook inside the carriage as they departed at dawn, casting dancing shadows across the burgundy velvet interior. Elira had chosen to ride inside rather than on horseback, partly for comfort during the long journey, but mostly to observe her new husband more closely. Kyle sat across from her, his long frame somehow managing to appear relaxed despite the confined space, though she noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the passing landscape through the small windows. The ancient lantern itself was a curiosity, forged of blackened iron and set with panels of what looked like crystallized starlight. When Elira had asked about it, the castle's steward had mentioned only that it had belonged to Winterhold for centuries, traditionally carried by couples making their way to the mountain estate. There was something almost mystical about the way its light seemed to pulse gently, as if responding to some unseen rhythm. Tell me about Winterhold, Elira said, as their carriage wound through the valley roads, flanked by 6 mounted guards. The morning had started crisp and clear, but she could see dark clouds gathering along the mountain peaks ahead. Kyle followed her gaze toward the ominous sky. It was built 3 centuries ago by Lord Aldwyn Greystone, a human noble who married a vampire lady named Seraphina. They wanted a place that belonged to neither world entirely, somewhere they could simply exist without the weight of politics and prejudice. His voice carried an odd note, something almost like longing. It has served as neutral ground ever since. And now it serves as our honeymoon retreat. Elira smiled slightly. I wonder what Lord Aldwyn would think of another politically motivated marriage seeking sanctuary in his castle. Perhaps he would approve. By all accounts, his marriage began as a political alliance as well. Kyle's storm-grey eyes met hers briefly. Though legend claims they found something deeper than duty in those mountain halls. Do you believe the legends? Kyle was quiet for a long moment, his gaze turning back to the window where snowflakes had begun to drift past. I believe that people create legends to make sense of things they cannot otherwise understand. Whether Aldwyn and Seraphina truly found love or simply learned to tolerate each other comfortably, does it matter? The result was the same, peace between their peoples. Elira studied his profile, noting the tension around his eyes. You sound as though you've given up on the possibility of anything beyond tolerance. Haven't you? The question came out sharper than he seemed to intend. Forgive me. That was presumptuous. No, it was honest. And yes, perhaps I had given up on certain possibilities, but that doesn't mean I've closed myself off to new ones. She adjusted her traveling cloak as the temperature in the carriage began to drop. After my first husband died, I thought my heart was a closed book. Yet here I am, curious about what these next few days might bring. The wind began to howl outside, and their driver called down from his perch. My lord, my lady, the weather's turning worse than expected. We may need to push harder to reach the castle before the storm hits in earnest. Kyle leaned out the window briefly, assessing the rapidly deteriorating conditions. When he pulled back in, his expression was grim. This is moving faster than the weather watchers predicted. We're still 3 hours from Winterhold, and this looks like it could become a blizzard. As if summoned by his words, the wind increased dramatically, rocking their carriage and causing the horses to whicker nervously. The snow, which had been gentle flakes moments before, now drove against the windows in thick, blinding sheets. Should we turn back? Elira asked, though even as she spoke, she could see the answer in Kyle's expression. Too late for that. We're closer to Winterhold than to any other shelter, and the road behind us will be impassable within the hour. He rapped on the carriage roof. Driver, can we make better time? Aye, my lord, but it's treacherous going. The horses are having trouble seeing the road. The next 2 hours passed in tense silence, both of them thrown together as the carriage lurched and swayed through increasingly dangerous mountain passes. Elira found herself pressed against Cale's side more than once as they navigated sharp turns, and each contact brought home the reality of his supernatural nature. His body temperature was noticeably cooler than human normal, and there was an otherworldly stillness about him, as if he didn't quite breathe the way mortals did. But she also noticed other things, the way he instinctively steadied her when the carriage hit a particularly rough patch, how he adjusted his cloak to help block the cold drafts that found their way through the carriage walls, the careful attention he paid to her comfort despite the circumstances. Are you afraid? She asked during a brief lull in the wind. Kyle considered the question with the seriousness he seemed to give everything. Not of the storm, no. I've survived far worse conditions. But I find myself concerned for your safety in a way that surprises me. Surprises you how? I had not expected to feel responsible for your well-being beyond the basic obligations of our arrangement. He frowned, as if his own words puzzled him. Yet I find the thought of you being harmed because of this journey unacceptable. Before Elira could respond, the carriage lurched violently and came to a sudden stop. Raised voices could be heard outside, the guards shouting to each other over the howling wind. Kyle was out of the carriage in an instant, moving with inhuman speed and grace. Elira followed more carefully, pulling her cloak tight against the bitter cold. The scene that greeted her was like something from a winter nightmare. Snow so thick she could barely make out the shapes of the guards and horses just a few feet away. Wind so fierce it threatened to knock her off her feet. "The road's completely blocked, my lord," one of the guards called out, barely audible over the storm. "Fallen trees and a rock slide. We can't get the carriage through." Kyle's jaw tightened as he assessed the situation. Through the swirling snow, Elira could just make out the dark bulk of fallen timber and scattered stones completely blocking their path. But beyond the obstruction, perhaps half a mile up the mountain, she could see a faint glow that might have been lights from Winterhold Castle. "We leave the carriage," Kyle decided. "Take only essential supplies. The horses can find shelter in that grove of pines. They'll survive the storm better than we will out here." "My lord," Elira said, touching his arm, "I'm not certain I can make that climb in these conditions." Kyle turned to her, and for a moment his carefully controlled expression cracked entirely. The concern in his eyes was raw and immediate. "Then I will carry you." "You can't carry me half a mile through a blizzard, Lady Elira." His voice cut through her protest with quiet authority. "I am stronger than I appear, and I will not leave you to freeze in this storm. We have no choice but to attempt the castle on foot." What followed was perhaps the most harrowing hour of Elira's life. True to his word, Kyle carried her when the drifts became too deep for her to manage, his supernatural strength making her weight seem insignificant. The guards struggled behind them, leading the horses toward whatever shelter they could find. The storm lantern, somehow still burning despite the wind and snow, became their guide through the white darkness. By the time they reached Winterhold Castle, Elira was numb with cold despite Kyle's efforts to shield her. The ancient fortress loomed out of the storm like something from a fairy tale. All dark stone towers and warm yellow windows, promising sanctuary from the supernatural fury of the blizzard. The castle's steward, an elderly man named Henrik, greeted them with hot wine and warm blankets, expressing dismay at their ordeal. "The storm came from nowhere, my lord. Our weather watchers saw nothing like this in their scrying. It's as if the mountain itself summoned the blizzard." As they stood in the great hall, dripping and exhausted, Elira realized that everything had changed in those desperate hours on the mountain. The formal distance they had maintained was impossible now. Kyle had risked himself to save her, had carried her to safety with a fierce protectiveness that went far beyond duty. And she had trusted him completely, placing her life in his hands without hesitation. "The guest chambers are prepared," Henrik continued, "though I should warn you that the storm has damaged some of the castle's systems. The east wing is without heat, so I've had to combine the arrangement somewhat. I hope you don't mind sharing the west wing's accommodations." Elira met Cale's eyes across the flickering firelight of the great hall. The careful propriety of separate chambers had just been swept away by circumstances beyond their control. For the next several days, however long the storm lasted, they would be sharing much closer quarters than either had planned. "That will be fine," Kyle said quietly, though she caught the slight tension in his voice. "We are grateful for any shelter from the storm." As Henrik led them through corridors lit by ancient torches, Elira couldn't shake the feeling that the blizzard had been more than mere weather. It felt like fate, or perhaps magic, conspiring to force them into the exact situation they had both been trying to avoid. The storm lantern flickered in Henrik's grasp, its crystalline panels seeming to pulse with approval, as if it too understood that some journeys require a complete abandonment of original plans. The next few days would test them both in ways neither had imagined. Trapped together in an ancient castle, with no escape and no distractions, They would have no choice but to truly discover who the other was beneath the careful facades they had constructed for their political marriage. Outside, the wind howled like something alive and hungry, sealing them into Winterhold Castle as effectively as any prison. But as Elira glanced at Cale's profile in the dancing torchlight, she wondered if perhaps this imprisonment might become the key to a freedom neither of them had dared to hope for. The ancient chess set dominated the small table between them, its pieces carved from dark walnut and pale birch, each figure worn smooth by centuries of use. Kyle had discovered it in the castle's library after their first awkward breakfast together, and something about the strategic nature of the game seemed to offer a safe middle ground for conversation. "Your move," Elira said, studying the board with the same careful attention she gave to mixing medicinal compounds. She had surprised him by accepting his invitation to play, and surprised him further by proving to be a formidable opponent. Kyle moved his knight, a piece shaped like a rearing horse with flowing mane. "You play with more aggression than I expected." "Did you expect me to be a timid player?" Elira's green eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement as she considered her options. "I learned the game from my late husband, who believed that hesitation in chess, as in life, leads only to defeat." A wise man. Kyle watched her fingers hover over her bishop, noting the confident way she handled the pieces. "Tell me about him, if you don't mind the question." Elira moved her bishop diagonally across the board, putting his king in an unexpected position of vulnerability. "Marcus was 10 years older than I when we married. I was barely 22, and thought I knew everything about the world." She smiled at the memory. "He was patient with my certainty, and gentle with my ignorance. We had 6 good years together before the fever took him." "And no children?" "We tried." Her voice remained steady, but Kyle caught the flicker of old pain. 3 times we lost babes before they could take their first breath. After the 3rd loss, I threw myself into learning everything I could about healing others, since I could not seem to heal my own grief. Kyle studied her across the chessboard, struck by the quiet strength in her admission. "I'm sorry. That must have been difficult to bear." "It was, but it led me to my calling as a healer, which has brought meaning to the years since." She gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall in thick curtains. "What about you? Have you ever loved someone deeply enough to grieve their loss?" The question caught him off guard. Kyle's hand stilled over his remaining rook as memories he had long buried threatened to surface. "Once. A very long time ago." "What happened?" "She was mortal. I was young, barely a century old, and foolish enough to believe that love could conquer the differences between our kinds." His voice grew distant. "Her name was Isabella. She had dark hair and laughed like music, and for 3 beautiful years, I forgot what I was." Elira waited, sensing there was more to the story. She aged as mortals do, not dramatically in 3 years, but enough that people began to notice the difference between us. She wanted children. I could not give her any. Kyle moved his rook finally, a defensive play that protected his king but sacrificed strategic position. When she died, not from age, but from a plague that swept through her village, I realized that loving mortals brought only pain. I decided never to make that mistake again. How long ago was this? 537 years. The precision of his answer spoke to how carefully he had marked the time since his last attempt at love. Elira captured his rook with her queen, but her attention was entirely focused on his face. "And you've been alone ever since?" "I've had companions, political alliances, strategic partnerships, even physical relationships when necessity demanded. But nothing that touched my heart. He studied the board, realizing he was now in serious danger of losing the game. After Isabella, I made it a practice to keep my heart carefully guarded. That's a long time to be lonely. Is it lonely if you don't allow yourself to feel the absence? Kyle asked, though even as he said it, he wasn't certain of the answer anymore. Elira considered this while moving her queen to a position that would threaten his remaining defenses. I think it might be lonelier, actually, to deny yourself the possibility of connection out of fear. That seems like the deepest loneliness of all. Their eyes met across the chessboard, and Kyle felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he had not experienced in centuries. This woman, with her direct manner and gentle wisdom, was proving more dangerous to his carefully constructed emotional walls than any enemy he had ever faced. "Your move," she said softly. He looked at the board and realized she had maneuvered him into an impossible position. In 3 moves, possibly 4 if he played defensively, she would have his king. But rather than irritation, he felt something like admiration. Well played. He moved his king, accepting the inevitable. You are a more strategic thinker than I gave you credit for. Don't sound so surprised. I've had to be strategic to survive as a woman alone for nearly 3 decades. Elira moved her queen for the final capture. Checkmate. Kyle stared at the board for a moment, then began to laugh, a sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. I haven't lost a chess match in over 2 centuries. Perhaps you needed a more challenging opponent. Perhaps I did. He began resetting the pieces for another game. Again? If you're certain you can handle another defeat. As they played their second game, the conversation flowed more easily. Kyle found himself telling her about the castle's history, sharing stories of the mysterious Lord Aldwyn and Lady Seraphina, who had built this place as their refuge from the world's prejudices. Henrik mentioned that the library contained some of Seraphina's journals, Kyle said, moving his queen to threaten her knight. She was apparently quite learned in both human and vampire lore. I would love to read them, if such a thing wouldn't be presumptuous. Nothing is presumptuous between us now. We're going to be sharing this space for several days. We might as well be comfortable. He paused, realizing how easily the word comfortable had slipped out. When had he begun thinking of her presence as comfortable rather than challenging? Elira captured his queen with her knight, and Kyle realized he had been so distracted by conversation that he hadn't seen the trap she'd laid for him. You're doing it again. What? Thinking like a strategist instead of just playing the game. She smiled, and the expression transformed her already attractive face into something radiant. Sometimes the best moves come from instinct rather than calculation. As they played on, Kyle found himself studying her hands as she moved the pieces, capable hands that had saved countless lives, gentle hands that showed no fear of his supernatural nature. When she accidentally brushed his fingers reaching for her bishop, he felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with his vampiric senses and everything to do with the warm, vital woman sitting across from him. "Tell me about your healing work," he said, genuinely curious. "Henrik mentioned that you've treated supernatural beings before. Word travels, I suppose." Elira leaned back in her chair, cradling her wine cup. "It started by accident. An injured werewolf stumbled into my cottage during a thunderstorm, and I couldn't turn away someone in pain, regardless of what they were. After I helped him heal, word spread through the supernatural community that there was a human healer who could be trusted. That was remarkably brave of you. Was it? I never thought of it that way. Someone needed help, and I had the skills to provide it. The rest seemed irrelevant. Kyle found himself moved by her simple acceptance of beings that most humans feared. You truly see no difference between human and supernatural suffering? Pain is pain. Fear is fear. The desire to survive and protect those we love, these things are universal. She moved her rook to support her advancing pawns. I learned more about healing from treating different species than I ever could have from human patients alone. Each type of being has unique vulnerabilities and strengths. As evening fell outside, and the storm continued its relentless assault on the castle walls, Kyle realized that this woman was systematically dismantling every assumption he had made about their marriage. She was not the fearful, resentful bride he had expected. She was not seeking to change or redeem him. She was simply herself, intelligent, compassionate, surprisingly fierce, and utterly without pretense. When she finally won their third game, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow with an anticipation he hadn't felt in decades. Elira's fingers traced the delicate silver chain of her locket as she sat by the fire on their second evening together. The small pendant had remained hidden beneath her dress during yesterday's conversations, but tonight, perhaps emboldened by the growing ease between them, she had allowed it to rest openly against her burgundy wool gown. Kyle noticed everything. Centuries of survival had honed his observational skills to supernatural sharpness, but he had learned to be selective about which observations he voiced. Tonight, however, curiosity overcame discretion. "That's beautiful," he said, nodding toward the locket. "An heirloom?" Elira's hand closed around the silver pendant protectively, then relaxed. "In a way. Marcus gave it to me on our first anniversary." She opened the delicate clasp with practiced ease, revealing a pressed flower, a small white rose, perfectly preserved despite its age. "This is from the bouquet I carried at our wedding." "You've worn it all these years?" "Every day since he died." She closed the locket carefully, then met Kyle's eyes with the directness that was becoming familiar to him. Some might call it dwelling in the past, but I prefer to think of it as carrying the best parts of love forward. Kyle was quiet for a long moment, studying the play of firelight across her serene features. "Do you ever wonder if holding on to those memories prevents you from making new ones?" "Do you?" The question was gentle but pointed. "You've spent 5 centuries avoiding new connections because of one old pain. Which of us is more trapped by the past?" Her words struck him with uncomfortable accuracy. He rose from his chair and moved to the tall windows that looked out over the storm-ravaged mountainside. Snow continued to fall, and the wind created an almost musical howling as it moved through the castle's ancient stonework. "Perhaps we are both guilty of letting old wounds dictate present choices," he admitted. "Perhaps. But we have time here to discover whether we can make different choices." Elira joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender in her hair and feel the warmth that radiated from her living body. "What do you remember most about being mortal?" The question surprised him with its intimacy. "Hope, I think. The sense that the future held infinite possibility rather than endless repetition." He turned to study her profile. "Why do you ask?" "Because I see glimpses of that hope returning when you forget to guard against it. When you laugh at something I've said, or when you become absorbed in explaining the castle's history. For those moments, you seem almost alive again." "Is that your professional assessment, Dr. Thornwick?" His tone was light, but she caught the underlying tension. "That's my personal observation, Lord Aldrich." She turned to face him fully. "And my name is Elira, We've moved beyond titles, haven't we? Have we? But even as he asked it, he knew the answer. They had moved beyond many things in just 2 days. Titles, formality, the careful emotional distance their arrangement was supposed to maintain. I think so. Kyle. His name on her lips sounded different than when others spoke it. Warmer, more intimate. Tell me about your mortal life. What did you lose besides the capacity for hope? He found himself answering, despite every instinct that screamed for caution. Music. I was quite accomplished on several instruments before my transformation. Afterward, I could play the notes perfectly, could execute even the most complex pieces flawlessly. But the music itself was gone. It became mere mathematical precision without soul. Would you play for me? I don't. He stopped, realizing he had been about to say he didn't play anymore. But that wasn't entirely true. There's a harpsichord in the library. But I warn you, it will be technically proficient and emotionally hollow. Let me be the judge of that. An hour later, they stood before an exquisite instrument inlaid with mother-of-pearl and carved with intricate roses. Kyle's hands hovered over the keys for a moment before he began to play. A piece by an obscure composer who had been popular during his mortal years. Elira had expected the cold perfection he had warned her about, but what she heard was something else, entirely. Yes, every note was precisely placed, every trill executed with supernatural dexterity, but underneath the technical mastery was something that sounded remarkably like longing. The piece he had chosen was melancholy and beautiful, speaking of loss and remembrance, with an aching clarity that no emotionally dead creature could have achieved. You're wrong, she said softly when the last notes faded. About what? That was not hollow. Lonely, perhaps. Achingly beautiful and full of sorrow. But not hollow. She moved to sit on the bench beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Play something else. Something from before. Before? Before you decided music was lost to you. Something from when you were mortal. Kyle's hands trembled slightly, the first time she had seen him display any physical uncertainty, before settling into the opening measures of a simple folk song. This time, his technical perfection slipped just enough to let emotion creep in. The melody was sweet and nostalgic, speaking of home and innocence, and the kind of joy that comes from simple pleasures. I taught that song to Isabella, he said, quietly. She used to hum it while she worked in her garden. It's lovely. I haven't played it since she died. Elira reached over and placed her hand gently over his on the keys. Thank you for sharing it with me. The contact sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with supernatural sensitivity. Her hand was warm and alive, and for a moment he could almost remember what it felt like to be warmed by another person's touch. Elira, he said, her name barely a whisper. Yes? I'm beginning to suspect that this arrangement between us may become more complicated than either of us intended. She didn't remove her hand from his. Are you frightened by that possibility? Terrified, he admitted. I had convinced myself that I was beyond such complications, that centuries of existence had burned out any capacity for genuine feeling. And now? Now I find myself looking forward to our conversations with something that feels dangerously close to eagerness. I catch myself watching your face when you speak, memorizing your expressions. When you laugh, I feel something stir that I had thought was permanently dead. Elira studied his profile in the soft light cast by the oil lamps Henrik had lit throughout the library. Would it help if I told you that I'm equally unsettled? I came to this marriage prepared for civility and companionship at best. I certainly didn't expect to find myself genuinely attracted to my husband. Attracted. The word seemed to surprise him. Don't sound so shocked. You're an extraordinarily handsome man, even setting aside the supernatural allure. More than that, you're intelligent and thoughtful, and far gentler than your reputation suggests. She finally moved her hand from his, but slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. I find myself curious about what might develop between us if we allowed it. And if allowing it leads to pain, to loss, then we will have known something beautiful, however briefly. Isn't that better than the alternative? Elira stood from the bench and faced him. I lost Marcus to fever. I know exactly how devastating it is to love someone and lose them. But I also know that I would rather have had those 6 years of happiness than a lifetime of safety without love. Kyle rose as well, and for a moment they stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. You make it sound simple. Simple, but not easy. The best things rarely are. She reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his cheekbone. You're not as cold as you think you are, Kyle. Your heart may have been sleeping, but I don't think it's dead. When she turned to leave the library, Kyle remained standing beside the harpsichord, one hand still resting on the keys. For the first time in 5 centuries, he could almost imagine making music that came from somewhere deeper than mere technical skill. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the library, something warmer than fire had begun to kindle. The mirror of winters past dominated the far wall of what Henrik had called the Lover's Chamber, a room they had discovered on their 3rd morning while exploring the castle's labyrinthine corridors. The mirror itself was extraordinary, framed in silver, so tarnished with age it appeared almost black, and set with small crystals that seemed to capture and hold light from sources that weren't visible in the room. Henrik mentioned this was where Lord Aldwyn and Lady Seraphina spent their winters, Elira said, running her fingers along the intricate carvings that decorated the mirror's frame. Tiny roses intertwined with thorns, and what looked like tears frozen into crystalline drops. He said the mirror has been here since the castle was built. Kyle stood several paces back, his expression uncharacteristically tense. Local legend claims it shows glimpses of the love stories that have unfolded within these walls. Romantic nonsense. Most likely. You seem uncomfortable with romantic nonsense. Elira turned to study his face, noting the way he kept his distance from the ornate-looking glass. Are you afraid it might actually work? I'm afraid it might show us things we're not prepared to see. As if responding to their conversation, the mirror's surface began to shimmer, like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. The reflection of the chamber faded, replaced by images that seemed to move with life of their own. Elira gasped softly as she recognized the room they stood in, but decorated differently. Richer tapestries, a fire burning in the hearth that was now cold, and 2 figures seated close together on a divan that no longer existed. The man had dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and the woman beside him had the pale beauty characteristic of vampire nobility, though her eyes held warmth rather than the cold calculation Elira had expected. Aldwyn and Seraphina, Kyle said quietly, moving closer despite his earlier reluctance. The mirror is showing us their past. In the reflection, they watched as the long-dead couple shared what appeared to be an intimate conversation. Seraphina's hand rested on Aldwyn's chest, directly over his heart, and even through the mystical viewing, the love between them was palpable. They don't look like a political arrangement, Elira observed. No, they don't. Kyle's voice held a note of something that might have been longing. But according to the histories, their marriage began exactly as ours did. A treaty between species, sealed with vows neither expected to mean anything. The mirror's image shifted, showing the same couple in different scenes throughout their life together. Seraphina tending to Aldwyn during what appeared to be an illness, her vampiric healing abilities keeping him alive far longer than any mortal should have survived. Aldwyn reading to Seraphina from books of poetry, her face radiant with joy at his words. The two of them dancing in the great hall, moving together with the perfect synchronization of hearts that had truly become one. How long were they together? Elira asked, mesmerized by the obvious devotion she was witnessing. 47 years until Aldwyn died of old age. Seraphina never remarried. Kyle paused, studying the mirror's visions. The histories say she grieved for him until her own death 3 centuries later. The mirror showed them one final scene. Seraphina, now alone, standing before this very mirror, with tears streaming down her face. But even in her grief, there was no regret in her expression. She touched her lips, then pressed her hand to the mirror's surface, as if saying goodbye to all the memories it held. Then the visions faded, leaving only their own reflections staring back at them. Elira turned to find Kyle watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. What are you thinking? That perhaps romantic nonsense is more dangerous than I realized. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the storm-grey depths of his eyes. What we just witnessed, that kind of love destroyed her. She lived for 3 centuries with nothing but memories. Or, Elira said gently, she lived for 3 centuries, knowing she had experienced something worth mourning. Not everyone gets to love that deeply, Kyle. Most people live entire lifetimes without feeling even a fraction of what we just witnessed. Is that what you want? That kind of intensity, knowing it will inevitably lead to loss? Elira considered the question seriously. I've already experienced loss, remember? I know exactly what it costs to love someone completely and then watch them die. But I also know what it's like to have loved and been loved in return. If you're asking me to choose between the pain of loss and the emptiness of never feeling anything at all, I choose the pain. Kyle reached out slowly, as if giving her time to retreat, and touched her face. His fingers were cold against her skin, but his touch was gentle. You're braver than I am. No, I'm just older and perhaps a bit wiser about what matters most. She leaned into his touch, startling them both with the naturalness of the gesture. What do you see when you look at me, Kyle? Really see? I see a woman who has lived through loss and came out stronger. Someone who chose compassion over bitterness, service over self-pity. I see intelligence and grace and a kind of inner fire that makes me remember what warmth felt like. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I see someone who makes me want to risk feeling again, even knowing the cost. And what do you see when you look in that mirror? Kyle glanced toward the ornate-looking glass, which now reflected only the two of them standing close together in the afternoon light. I see a man who has been dead for so long, he forgot what it meant to be alive. But when I'm with you, when we talk or play chess or simply sit quietly together, I feel something stirring that I thought was lost forever. What does it feel like? Hope, he said. The word barely a whisper. Dangerous, terrifying hope. Before either of them could think better of it, Kyle leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, The kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, as if he expected her to pull away or disappear like a mirage. But Elira stepped closer instead, her hands coming up to rest against his chest as she kissed him back with a warmth that seemed to flow between them like spring water. When they finally separated, both were breathing unsteadily. "That was—" Kyle began. "A mistake?" Elira asked, though her tone suggested she hoped otherwise. "Inevitable," he finished. "I've been wanting to do that since yesterday evening when you touched my face in the library." "Only since yesterday?" Elira's eyes sparkled with gentle mischief. "I've been curious about what it would be like to kiss you since our wedding night, when you looked at me as if I were some fascinating puzzle you couldn't quite solve." "You are a fascinating puzzle." Cale's arms came around her waist, holding her close. "I spent 8 centuries convincing myself that I was beyond such foolishness, and then you appeared with your healing herbs and your gentle wisdom and your complete lack of fear. And suddenly I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my own nature. Perhaps that's exactly what you needed." As they held each other in the room where Lord Aldwyn and Lady Seraphina had discovered their own unexpected love, the mirror of winter's past reflected their image back to them. 2 souls who had thought themselves beyond the reach of passion, now caught in the early stages of a connection neither had planned, but both were beginning to treasure. Outside, the storm continued, but neither of them minded being trapped anymore. The bloodstone pendant pressed cold against Cale's chest as he stood at the library window the following morning, watching snow continue to fall in the pale dawn light. The ancient stone, passed down through generations of vampire lords, had always been simply another piece of formal regalia, until now, since their kiss in the lover's chamber yesterday, the pendant had begun to burn with an uncomfortable chill whenever he tried to deny or suppress the feelings Elira had awakened in him. He touched the stone through his shirt, wincing at the ice-cold sensation that seemed to pierce straight through to his heart. According to family legend, the bloodstone had been enchanted centuries ago to reflect the true emotional state of its wearer, growing cold when they lived in denial of their nature, and warming when they embraced their authentic selves. Kyle had always dismissed such stories as superstition, but the pendant's recent behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. "You're up early," Elira said from the library doorway, her voice soft with the intimacy of sleep. She wore a simple green dress today, and her silver-streaked hair fell loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her usual composed self. "I don't require as much sleep as mortals do." The words came out more curtly than he had intended, and he saw her flinch slightly. The pendant grew even colder against his skin, as if punishing him for his deliberate distance. "I see." Elira moved into the room but kept her distance, settling into one of the reading chairs rather than approaching the window where he stood. "Are you having regrets about yesterday?" The direct question was so characteristic of her that, despite his internal turmoil, Kale almost smiled. "Yes and no. The regret is not about kissing you, it's about wanting to do it again." "That seems like an odd thing to regret." Kyle turned from the window to face her, noting the careful way she held herself, as if prepared for rejection. "Elira, you must understand what you are asking of me. I've spent 5 centuries building walls around my heart for very practical reasons. Every mortal I've ever cared about has died while I remained unchanged. Every connection I've formed has ended in loss and grief that vampires feel far more intensely than humans can imagine. Are you saying you don't want to explore what's developing between us? I'm saying I'm terrified of it." The admission seemed to surprise them both. "Yesterday, when you kissed me back, when you looked at me as if I were something precious rather than monstrous. For a moment, I felt alive in a way I haven't experienced since my mortal days, and that terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced." Elira set down the book she had been pretending to read. "What exactly frightens you about feeling alive? Because when you inevitably die, the pain of losing you will be magnified by every moment of joy we shared. Because caring for you makes me vulnerable in ways that could endanger not just myself, but you as well. Because—" He stopped, his hand moving unconsciously to the pendant as it sent another spike of cold through his chest. "Because what?" "Because I'm no longer certain I can survive losing someone I love again. Isabella's death nearly destroyed me, and I cared for you more deeply after 4 days than I cared for her after 4 months." The confession hung between them in the morning silence. Elira rose from her chair and moved toward him slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. "Kyle, what if, instead of focusing on the inevitability of loss, we focused on the possibility of joy? What if we allowed ourselves to discover what we could build together, for however long we have? You make it sound simple. I make it sound worthwhile." She stopped just outside his reach, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I can't promise you forever. No mortal can. But I can promise you honesty, companionship, and whatever love I'm capable of giving for whatever time we have together." The pendant against his chest had begun to warm slightly, as if responding to his wavering resolve. "And when you die, when I'm left alone again with centuries more of existence ahead of me, then you'll grieve, as anyone who loves deeply must eventually grieve. But you'll also carry forward the memory of what we shared, and perhaps, just perhaps, that will make the long years ahead more bearable rather than less." Kyle studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt or false optimism, but finding only the steady compassion he had come to associate with her. "You're asking me to take a leap of faith that goes against everything I've learned about self-preservation. I'm asking you to take a leap of faith that might teach you something new about what makes existence worthwhile." Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the castle, followed by the sound of falling stone. They rushed to the window together, looking out at the courtyard where a section of the east tower's roof had collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. "The storm's damage is getting worse," Elira observed, but her attention was caught by something else. In the courtyard below, she could see Henrik struggling with debris that had trapped him partially beneath fallen stones. Without thinking, both Kyle and Elira rushed from the library toward the castle's main entrance. But as they reached the great hall, another section of masonry gave way, blocking the direct path to the courtyard and forcing them to find an alternate route. "This way," Kyle said, leading her through a series of servants' corridors that he had explored during his sleepless hours. As they navigated the narrow passages, a support beam groaned ominously overhead, and suddenly Kyle's arm was around Elira's waist, pulling her against him as debris rained down where she had been standing moments before. They stood pressed together in the dim corridor, breathing hard from the near miss. Kyle's supernatural hearing picked up Henrik's voice, calling for help from somewhere beyond the blocked passages, but for a moment all he could focus on was the feeling of Elira's warm body against his, the way her hands had instinctively gripped his shirt, the trust she had shown by allowing him to protect her without question. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. "No, thanks to you." She looked up into his face, her expression serious. "You saved me." "It was instinct." "Was it?" Or was it love? The question was gentle, without pressure, but it cut straight through all his carefully constructed defenses. Kyle's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. When I saw that beam falling toward you, the only thing I could think was that I couldn't lose you. Not now, when I'm just beginning to remember what it feels like to hope for tomorrow. Then don't lose me. Elira's hand covered his where it rested against her face. Don't lose us before we've even discovered what we could be. The pendant against his chest had grown warm now, almost comfortable, as if approving of his emotional honesty. Outside, Henrik's calls were growing more urgent, but for just a moment longer, Kyle allowed himself to stand in this dim corridor, holding the woman who was systematically dismantling every wall he had spent centuries building. "All right," he said finally. "All right, Elira. I'm willing to try, if you're willing to be patient with a man who has forgotten how to be anything other than afraid." Her smile was radiant. "I have all the patience in the world, as long as you have the courage to let me use it." As they made their way toward Henrik and the continuing crisis, Kyle realized that the bloodstone pendant had never felt so warm against his heart. The Blood Covenant scroll lay unrolled across the ancient oak table in the castle's deepest archive, its parchment so old it seemed to glow with an inner light in the flickering candlelit chamber. Elira ran her fingers along the elaborate calligraphy, noting symbols that looked familiar from her studies of supernatural healing, while Kale stood rigid beside her, his face pale even by vampire standards. They had come to the archives to research the castle's structural problems after rescuing Henrik, but what they had found instead would change everything between them. "Read it again," Kyle said, his voice hollow. "Please, tell me I misunderstood." Elira's healer's training had included learning to read ancient texts in multiple languages, including the formal Latin used for supernatural treaties. Her translation had been methodical and careful, but the implications were staggering. "The Covenant states that our marriage creates not just a political bond, but a mystical one," she said, her finger tracing the relevant passages. "When two souls unite under the auspices of peace between warring peoples, and when that union awakens true feeling in hearts that have been sealed against love, the ancient magic of the Covenant activates." "Activates how?" "According to this, your immortal nature is already beginning to change. The magic is slowly making you mortal again, returning to you the capacity for full human emotion and sensation." Elira looked up from the scroll to meet his eyes. "But there's a cost." Kyle's jaw tightened. "There always is." "What kind of cost?" "If you fully embrace the transformation, if you allow your heart to open completely to love, you will become entirely mortal. You'll age and die as humans do. But you'll also be able to feel joy, hope, and love with an intensity you've forgotten." She paused, her voice growing softer. "But if you resist the transformation now that it's begun, the magical backlash will be deadly." "Deadly to whom?" "To me." The words came out as barely a whisper. "The Covenant binds our life forces together. If you reject the transformation, the magic will drain my life force to compensate for the disruption. I would die within days." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft crackling of the candles and the distant sound of wind through the castle's stone corridors. Kyle turned away from the table, his hands clenching into fists. "How long do we have?" "According to this, the transformation takes 7 days to complete once it begins in earnest. We're already on day 5 of our time here." Elira rolled up the scroll carefully, her movements precise, despite the tremor in her hands. The magic activates when two people destined for each other are brought together under the covenant's conditions and begin to develop genuine feelings. Destined for each other. Kyle's laugh was bitter. A mystical, predetermined fate. How remarkably convenient. Kale, no. He spun to face her, his eyes blazing with an anger that seemed to encompass the entire situation. Don't you understand what this means? Everything we felt, every moment of connection, it's all been manipulated by ancient magic. None of it was real. Elira stood slowly, her expression calm despite the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Is that what you truly believe? That the conversations we've shared, the laughter, the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, all of that was just magical manipulation? How can we know for certain? How can we trust any feeling when there's magic involved? Because magic doesn't create emotions from nothing, Kale. It can enhance what already exists. It can remove barriers that prevent connection. But it cannot manufacture love where no potential for it exists. She moved around the table toward him, her voice gentle but firm. What we've discovered is that we were compatible in ways neither of us expected. The magic simply removed the walls we had both built to protect ourselves from exactly this kind of connection. And now, his voice was raw, what happens now? Do I condemn myself to mortality for a love that might be nothing more than mystical coercion? Or do I preserve my immortality and watch you die because of choices I made? Now you decide what matters most to you. Elira reached out and took his hands, noting that they were no longer as cold as they had been when they first met. The transformation was already well advanced. But you should know that from my perspective, the choice is simple. Simple? I've lived 53 years, Kyle. I've loved and lost. I've found my calling as a healer. I've made peace with who I am and what my life has meant. If I died tomorrow, I could say I lived fully. She squeezed his hands. But you've spent 5 centuries existing without truly living. This covenant offers you the chance to experience mortality again, to feel everything with the intensity you remember from your human years, to love without reservation and be loved in return. For perhaps 40 years if I'm fortunate. Then I die and leave you alone. Then we die and leave each other memories that will comfort whoever survives. Elira's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. Don't you see? This isn't about cheating death or avoiding loss. This is about choosing to live fully for whatever time we have. Kyle pulled his hands free and began pacing the small archive chamber. You're asking me to give up 8 centuries of accumulated power, knowledge, and influence, to abandon my responsibilities to my people, my clan, my territory. I'm not asking you anything. This is your choice to make. Elira sat down in one of the chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 53 years. But I will say this, your people have lived under your rule for centuries. Perhaps it's time to consider whether they might benefit from a leader who rules with a full heart rather than calculated strategy. And if I choose mortality? If I embrace this transformation? What guarantee do I have that what I feel for you is real and lasting, rather than the product of magical manipulation? The same guarantee any mortal has when they choose to love someone. None at all. Elira smiled sadly. Love always requires a leap of faith, Kyle. Magic or no magic, covenant or no covenant, choosing to open your heart to another person always means risking pain. The only question is whether you believe the possibility of joy is worth the certainty of eventual loss. Kyle stopped pacing and stared at her. In the candlelight, she looked both fragile and indomitable, a woman who had faced loss before and emerged stronger, now willing to face it again for his sake. If I choose to resist the transformation, if I decide my immortality is worth more then I die, and you continue existing exactly as you have for 5 centuries, alone, untouchable, and emotionally dead. Her voice held no accusation, only sadness. That's your right, Kyle. No one can force you to choose love over safety. But you would die hating me. No. She stood and moved to where he had stopped pacing, reaching up to touch his face gently. I would die knowing that I had experienced something beautiful, even if briefly. I would die grateful that for a few days I felt truly alive again. The bloodstone pendant against Cale's chest had grown burning hot, responding to the emotional intensity of the moment and his internal struggle. He could feel the magic of the covenant working through his system, could sense his immortal nature slowly giving way to something more human and vulnerable. 7 days, he said finally. The transformation completes in 7 days total? According to the scroll, yes, which means we have 2 days left to decide. To decide whether I choose mortality and love or immortality and your death. To decide whether you choose to live or simply to exist. Elira's hand dropped from his face, but she continued to hold his gaze. I can't make this choice for you, Kyle. But I can tell you that whatever you decide, I won't regret these days we've had together. They've been among the happiest of my life. As she turned to leave the archive chamber, Kyle caught her hand. Elira, if I choose the transformation, if I become mortal for you, will that be enough? Will what we have be strong enough to sustain us through a lifetime together? She turned back to face him, and in her eyes he saw not magical manipulation, but the same complex mixture of hope, fear, and determination that he felt in his own heart. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think it would be worth finding out. After she left, Kyle remained alone in the archive chamber with the Blood Covenant scroll and the weight of an impossible choice. Outside, he could hear the storm beginning to intensify again, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath for his decision. The phoenix feather quill lay across the open pages of Seraphina's ancient journal, its iridescent plumes catching the firelight in the castle's most sacred chamber. Kyle had found the quill wrapped in silk within a hidden compartment of Lady Seraphina's writing desk, and according to her detailed notes, it was the key to safely completing the mystical transformation that the Blood Covenant had begun. Listen to this, Elira said, her voice hoarse from hours of reading through Seraphina's research. She had spread dozens of journals, spell books, and historical documents across the chamber's large table, creating a maze of knowledge that might save both their lives. Seraphina writes that she and Aldwyn faced the exact same choice we're facing now. Kyle looked up from his own stack of texts, his expression grim. They had spent their 6th day frantically searching the castle's libraries and archives for any solution that might allow him to embrace mortality without the deadly magical backlash that would kill Elira. What did they decide? They found a way to complete the transformation safely, but it required a ritual of mutual sacrifice. Elira's finger traced the elegant script of Seraphina's journal. Both partners must willingly give up something essential to save the other. The phoenix feather quill is used to rewrite the magical bonds, creating a new covenant that protects both parties during the transformation. What kind of sacrifice? Elira was quiet for a long moment, reading ahead in the journal before responding. For the vampire, surrendering immortality and supernatural power is only part of it. According to this, you would also have to give up all memory of your vampire years. You would become fully mortal. but you would remember only your human life and these past few days with me." Kyle felt something cold settle in his stomach. 8 centuries of existence? Gone? Serafina describes it as being reborn rather than losing memories. You would retain your essential self, your personality, your intelligence, your capacity for love, but the weight of centuries would be lifted from you. You would be free to experience mortality without the burden of comparing it to immortal existence. And what would you have to sacrifice? My healer's power. Elira's voice was steady, but he could see the cost of this admission in her eyes. The ritual would drain my supernatural ability to heal others. I would retain my medical knowledge and skill, but the mystical aspect of my healing, the ability to cure supernatural ailments, to heal injuries that should be fatal, would be transferred to anchor your transformation. Kyle stared at her across the table, laden with ancient books. Your healing ability is who you are. It's your calling, your purpose, the thing that has given meaning to your life for 30 years. Yes. You would give that up for me? Elira set down the journal and met his eyes directly. Kyle, my healing power has allowed me to save lives, but it has also kept me isolated from normal human connection. I've spent 3 decades serving others while never allowing anyone to serve me in return. Perhaps it's time I discovered what it means to simply live as a woman, rather than as a mystical healer. But the good you could do, the lives you could save, I've saved the lives I was meant to save. Now I want to save yours, and mine, and see what life we can build together. She stood and moved around the table to where he sat, placing her hands on his shoulders. The question is whether you're willing to give up your immortal memories to gain a mortal future. Kyle covered her hands with his own, feeling the warmth that had become so precious to him over these past days. I don't know who I would be without those centuries of experience. What if I'm not the same person you've come to care for? According to Serafina's notes, the essential you would remain unchanged. Your fundamental nature, your capacity for kindness and love, your intelligence and humor, those aren't products of your vampire years. They're who you were as a mortal man, and who you've always been underneath the supernatural overlay. She seems remarkably certain of that. She performed the ritual with Aldwyn, remember? She lived with the results for 47 years of marriage. Elira squeezed his shoulders. She writes that he remained completely himself, just freed from the burden of remembering centuries of loss and loneliness. Kyle rose and began pacing the chamber, his movements restless with anxiety. Outside, the storm had intensified again, as if responding to the magical energies building within the castle. They could hear the wind howling through the stone corridors, and periodically the entire structure would shudder under the force of supernatural winds. When would we need to perform this ritual? Tomorrow night, at the stroke of midnight on the 7th day. That's when the Covenant's magic reaches its peak and can be safely redirected. Elira followed him with her eyes as he paced. If we wait longer, the magical backlash becomes inevitable. If we attempt it earlier, the power isn't strong enough to sustain the transformation. And if something goes wrong during the ritual, then we both die. Her honesty was characteristic and somehow comforting. Serafina is quite clear about that. The ritual either succeeds completely or it kills both participants. There's no middle ground. Kyle stopped pacing and turned to face her. Are you truly willing to risk your life on the hope that this ancient ritual will work? To sacrifice your greatest gift for the chance at a normal marriage with a man who might not even remember why he loved you in the first place? Elira was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Do you remember why you fell in love with Isabella all those centuries ago? Of course. Not the supernatural attraction, not the mystical connection. Do you remember the simple human reasons? The sound of her laughter, the way she challenged your assumptions, the comfort of her presence? Kyle nodded, beginning to understand her point. Those are the reasons you've begun to love me as well, aren't they? Not because of my healing power or your vampire nature, but because of who we are when we're simply two people talking by a fire, or playing chess, or sharing stories of our past. Elira moved closer to him. If the ritual works, those feelings will remain. You might not remember our wedding, or the political circumstances that brought us together, but you'll remember these past few days when we discovered we could genuinely care for each other. And if I become someone different, if mortality changes me in ways we can't predict, then we'll discover who you are together, the same way any couple does when they choose to build a life together. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp cheekbones that had become so familiar to her. Kyle, I'm 53 years old. I know the difference between loving someone for who they are and loving them for who we wish they were. What I feel for you isn't based on your supernatural nature or your immortal knowledge. It's based on your kindness, your intelligence, your dry sense of humor, and the way you look at me as if I'm something precious. Those qualities might not survive the transformation. They survived 8 centuries of emotional numbness and supernatural isolation. I think they'll survive mortality. Elira smiled, and despite everything, he felt his heart lift at the expression. Besides, what's the alternative? You remain immortal, I die, and you spend eternity wondering what might have been if you'd been brave enough to choose love over safety. Kyle pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the storm raged outside and the castle shuddered around them. Tomorrow night, they would either begin a new life together or die in the attempt. The choice was finally clear to him. All right, he said, his voice muffled against her hair. I choose you, I choose us, I choose mortality and whatever consequences come with it. Are you certain? I'm terrified, he admitted. But yes, I'm certain. I've spent 5 centuries existing without really living. If I can have even 20 years of genuine life with you, it will be worth more than eternity alone. They spent the rest of that evening preparing for the ritual, gathering the materials Seraphina's journal specified, candles made from beeswax blessed by moonlight, silver bowls for mixing their blood, crystals to focus the magical energies, and herbs to ease the transformation's physical toll. Each item had to be prepared with exact specifications, and each carried its own symbolic meaning in the ancient magic they were attempting to harness. As midnight approached, they made their final preparations in the castle's most sacred chamber, the same room where Lord Aldwyn and Lady Seraphina had performed this same ritual 3 centuries earlier. The phoenix feather quill lay ready beside the scroll where Kyle would rewrite their magical bond, its iridescent plumes seeming to glow with their own inner fire. Whatever happens tomorrow night, Elira said, as they stood together, looking out at the storm-lashed mountainside. I want you to know that these have been the most meaningful days of my life, not just because of what we might become, but because of what we've already shared. And if the ritual fails, if we don't survive tomorrow night, then we'll have proven that love is worth any risk, any sacrifice. And perhaps that's the most important thing 2 people can ever prove. Elira turned in his arms to face him. No regrets, Kyle. Whatever tomorrow brings, no regrets. As they kissed in the candlelit chamber, the phoenix feather quill pulsed with gentle light, as if already responding to the love that would soon either transform them both or destroy them completely. The heart's compass glowed softly at the center of their ritual circle, its golden needle spinning gently before settling to point directly toward where Kale and Elira knelt facing each other. The ancient device, discovered hidden within Seraphina's personal effects, was designed to measure the authenticity of love between two souls. Only genuine, deep affection could cause it to activate and guide the ritual's mystical energies. Midnight had arrived, with supernatural precision. The storm outside had suddenly stilled, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The ritual chamber was illuminated by 13 candles arranged in a perfect circle, their flames burning unnaturally bright and steady despite the drafts that moved through the ancient stone room. "Are you ready?" Elira asked, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. She wore a simple white gown that had belonged to Lady Seraphina, while Kyle was dressed in the formal black and silver of his vampire heritage, clothing that might soon become meaningless relics of a past he would no longer remember. "As ready as one can be for voluntary death and rebirth," Kyle replied, attempting levity, but unable to hide the tension in his voice. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the phoenix feather quill, its iridescent plumes seeming to pulse with their own heartbeat. The heart's compass began to glow brighter as he spoke the first words of the ritual, ancient phrases in a language that predated both human and vampire civilizations. The needle spun faster, creating a small vortex of golden light at the compass's center. "I, Kale Aldrich, Lord of the Northern Reaches, do willingly surrender my immortal nature for the chance to love and be loved as a mortal man." His voice grew stronger as he continued, the formal words carrying weight that seemed to press against the very air around them. "I offer my memories of 8 centuries in exchange for a mortal lifetime with the woman I choose above all else." The phoenix feather quill grew warm in his hand as mystical energies began to gather in the chamber. He could feel his supernatural senses starting to dim, as if a veil was slowly being drawn across perceptions that had been razor-sharp for 800 years. The change was subtle but unmistakable, colors becoming slightly less vivid, sounds growing marginally muted, the constant awareness of supernatural presences beginning to fade. "I, Elira Thornwick, do willingly surrender my mystical healing gift for the chance to anchor this transformation and share a mortal life with the man I have come to love." Elira's voice was steady and sure as she spoke her part of the ancient covenant. "I offer my power to heal the supernatural in exchange for the opportunity to heal one heart that has been broken too long." As she spoke, warmth began to flow from her hands into the silver bowls before them, though she had not yet touched them. The mystical energy that had always hummed beneath her conscious awareness, the power that allowed her to sense injury and illness, to channel healing force through her touch, began to gather and concentrate, preparing to leave her forever. The heart's compass spun faster, its golden light expanding to encompass both of them. Within that light, they could see glimpses of possible futures, fragments of a life they might share if the ritual succeeded. Kyle as a mortal man, his face softer without the predatory sharpness of his vampire nature. Elira beside him, her healing hands now simply the hands of a woman who loved him. Images of them growing old together, finding joy in simple pleasures, building a life based on companionship rather than duty. "The first phase is working," Elira breathed, watching as Kale's supernatural pallor began to warm to something approaching human coloring. Your immortal nature is releasing its hold. Kyle felt the truth of her words in his bones. The cold that had been his constant companion for 8 centuries was slowly giving way to something warmer and more vital. His heartbeat, which had been barely perceptible for so long, began to strengthen and quicken. Most remarkably, he could feel emotions with a clarity and intensity that he had almost forgotten was possible. "I can feel everything," he said, wonderingly. "Not just the shadow of feelings I've grown used to, but full, complete emotion. Joy, fear, hope, love. All of it so much stronger than I remembered. The ritual is returning your full capacity for human feeling." Elira's own transformation was becoming visible as well. The subtle luminescence that had always surrounded her hands when she healed was gradually fading, her mystical gift flowing outward to fuel Kale's change. The phoenix feather quill began to write of its own accord, tracing new words across the parchment before them in script that glowed with golden fire. The words rewrote their mystical bond, replacing the deadly either-or clause of the original covenant with something more generous and hopeful. But as the first phase of the transformation reached its peak, both of them began to feel the enormous strain the magic was placing on their bodies. Kale's head throbbed as centuries of memories began to blur and fade, while Elira grew pale as her life force was drawn upon to anchor his change. "The critical moment is coming," she warned, though her voice was growing weak. "We must both commit completely, or the ritual will destroy us both." The heart's compass flared with brilliant light, its needle now pointing steadily toward their joined hands, confirming that their love was genuine enough to sustain them through the magical transformation. Around them, the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility and danger in equal measure. The unity chalice materialized in the golden light between them, formed from the very essence of their mystical bond, a ceremonial cup that seemed to be carved from crystallized starlight and moonbeams. As the ritual reached its most dangerous phase, the chalice filled with their mingled blood without either of them touching it, the crimson liquid swirling with silver light that pulsed in rhythm with their synchronized heartbeats. Kyle felt his consciousness fragmenting as 8 centuries of memories began to slip away, like sand through his fingers. The faces of countless allies and enemies grew, dim and indistinct. Political machinations that had once seemed crucial faded to meaningless shadows. The weight of immortal responsibility that had pressed upon him for so long was lifting, but the process felt like dying and being born simultaneously. "Elira," he gasped, reaching for her across the ritual circle, as waves of disorientation threatened to overwhelm him. I'm losing everything. I can't remember why any of this matters." Her hand clasped his firmly, and her touch became his anchor in the mystical storm. "Remember me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with perfect clarity. "Remember these 7 days. Remember choosing love over fear." The heart's compass spun wildly as the magical energies reached their peak, its golden light now blazing so brightly that it illuminated the entire chamber. The unity chalice rose into the air between them, its contents glowing with power that seemed to draw from the very foundations of the castle. Elira felt her healing gift being torn from her like a physical wound, decades of mystical ability flowing out of her in a torrent of silver light that wrapped around Kale's transforming form. The pain was extraordinary, not physical, but a profound spiritual emptiness as the core of her identity for 30 years was sacrificed to save the man she loved. "I can't feel the healing power anymore," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's gone. All of it." But I can feel you, Kyle said, his voice stronger despite his ongoing transformation. I can feel your love, your courage, your willingness to sacrifice everything for us. That's real, Elira. That's more real than any magic. The Phoenix Feather Quill continued writing their new covenant, its script blazing across multiple scrolls now as it rewrote the fundamental nature of their bond. Where the original blood covenant had demanded impossible choices, the new agreement spoke of balance, mutual support, and a love strong enough to survive any transformation. The Unity Chalice descended to hover just above their joined hands, and somehow they both understood that they must drink from it together to complete the ritual. But as Kyle reached for the chalice, a massive surge of magical feedback tore through the chamber, sending both of them crashing to the floor as the ritual energies went wild. "Something's wrong," Elira cried, struggling to her feet, despite the mystical chaos swirling around them. The candles flickered wildly, and cracks appeared in the stone walls as the magical forces threatened to tear the castle apart. Kyle's transformation had stalled at the most critical moment. He was trapped between mortal and immortal, his vampire nature fighting against the change, while his human heart yearned toward it. The conflicting energies were building to an explosion that would destroy them both. The ritual requires complete commitment from both parties, he realized, his voice hoarse with strain. "I'm still holding back. Some part of me is still afraid to let go of immortality completely." "Then let go," Elira said, moving toward him despite the dangerous magical currents that crackled through the air. "Trust me. Trust us. Trust that what we have is worth any sacrifice. If I let go completely and this fails, then we fail together." She knelt beside him as the Unity Chalice spun above them, its light flickering as the ritual wavered on the edge of catastrophic collapse. "But if you don't let go, we definitely fail. And I refuse to let our story end with you too afraid to reach for happiness." Something in her words, or perhaps the absolute certainty in her voice, finally broke through the last of Kyle's resistance. With a sound that was half sob and half laugh, he released every remaining thread of connection to his immortal nature. 8 centuries of supernatural power flowed out of him in a rush of silver fire that merged with Elira's sacrificed healing gift. The Unity Chalice blazed with sudden, brilliant light as the ritual energies finally found their proper balance. Kyle's transformation completed in an instant. His fangs disappeared, his supernatural strength faded to mortal levels, his immortal memories dissolved into gentle mist. But his essential self remained intact, and his love for Elira burned brighter than ever. Elira felt the magical drain on her life force suddenly ease as the new covenant took hold. Her healing gift was gone forever, but she was alive and whole, and the man she loved was looking at her with fully mortal eyes that blazed with joy and recognition. They reached for the Unity Chalice together, their hands meeting around its crystalline surface. When they drank, the liquid tasted like starlight and promises, sealing their bond as two mortals who had chosen love over safety and found it worth every sacrifice. The magical storm subsided, leaving them alive, transformed, and finally, truly free to love each other without reservation. The wedding crown of Winterhold rested on the mantelpiece in the great hall, its ancient silver gleaming in the morning sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. Henrik had discovered the crown in a vault beneath the castle after their transformation, explaining with tears in his eyes that it was traditionally worn by couples who found true love within these walls. The crown was beautiful in its simplicity, a circlet of intertwined silver bands set with small diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. The storm has finally passed, Elira observed, standing beside Kyle at the window. Outside, the world sparkled under fresh snow, and the mountain peaks stood clear against a brilliant blue sky. After 7 days of supernatural weather, the natural calm felt like a benediction. Kyle slipped his arm around her waist, marveling once again at how different everything felt now that he was fully mortal. Colors seemed richer, sensations more immediate, and emotions, especially his love for Elira, burned with an intensity that took his breath away. He remembered their 7 days together with perfect clarity, but his centuries of vampire existence had faded to distant dreams that no longer carried any emotional weight. "How do you feel?" she asked, studying his face with the careful attention of a healer, though her mystical abilities were gone forever. "Like myself, but more so." He turned to smile at her, noting how the morning light brought out the gold flecks in her green eyes. "I remember being mortal before, but I was so young then. Now I have the wisdom of experience, combined with the capacity to feel everything fully. It's—" He paused, searching for words. "It's extraordinary." Henrik appeared in the doorway, beaming at them both. "My lord and lady, the rescue party from Ravencrest has arrived. They're preparing the road for your return journey, though they say it will be another day before travel is safe." "Thank you, Henrik." Elira squeezed Kyle's hand. "One more day here together, before we face the world as a truly married couple." After Henrik departed, they moved to sit before the fireplace, where the wedding crown of Winterhold caught the dancing light of the flames. Neither had spoken directly about what their return to the kingdom would mean, but both understood that everything had changed. "My vampire clan will need a new leader," Kyle said quietly. "I can no longer fulfill those responsibilities as a mortal man." "Do you regret that loss?" He considered the question seriously. "No. I feel relief more than regret. 8 centuries of political maneuvering and supernatural responsibility, I'm grateful to be free of it." He touched her face gently. "Though I worry about leaving a power vacuum that could destabilize the peace we were meant to create. Perhaps our marriage accomplished its purpose in a different way than anyone expected. Your transformation from vampire lord to mortal man, that's a powerful symbol of change and hope. It might encourage others to consider peaceful solutions rather than violent ones." Kyle smiled at her wisdom. Always the diplomat. "What about you? Do you regret losing your healing gift?" Elira was quiet for a long moment, flexing her fingers as if testing for abilities that were no longer there. "I feel lighter," she said finally. "For 30 years, I carried the weight of knowing I could heal others while being unable to heal my own loneliness. Now I'm just a woman who loves her husband and wants to build a life with him. It's simpler, and perhaps that simplicity is exactly what I need. What kind of life do you imagine us building?" "A quiet one, I hope. Maybe we'll find a small estate somewhere between human and supernatural territories, close enough to both that we can serve as ambassadors if needed, but far enough from politics to simply be ourselves." She leaned against his shoulder, enjoying the steady warmth of his mortal body. "I'd like to tend a garden, learn to cook something besides medicinal broths, read books for pleasure rather than research." "That sounds perfect." Kyle kissed the top of her head. "Though I should warn you, I have no idea what skills I possess as a mortal man. I may need to learn an entirely new profession. We'll figure it out together. That's what marriage is for, isn't it? Learning to build something new as a partnership." As afternoon turned to evening, they found themselves drawn back to the wedding crown of Winterhold, According to Henrik, tradition required that they crown each other as the sun set on their final day at the castle, a symbolic recognition that they had found something worth celebrating. "Are you ready?" Elira asked, as the western sky began to glow with sunset colors. Kyle lifted the crown from the mantelpiece, its silver bands warm to the touch. "I've never been more ready for anything in my very long life." They stood facing each other in the great hall, the same space where they had arrived as strangers, bound by political necessity, just 1 week ago. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Cale's supernatural otherworldliness had been replaced by a vitality that was purely human, while Elira's careful reserve had given way to an openness that radiated contentment. "Elira Thornwick," Kale said formally, holding the crown above her head, "you have taught me that love is not weakness, but the greatest strength of all. You have shown me that sacrifice shared becomes joy doubled. Will you wear this crown as a symbol that we choose each other not from duty, but from love?" "I will," she replied, tears of happiness sparkling in her eyes. As he placed the crown on her head, its diamonds caught the firelight and seemed to glow with their own inner radiance. Then Elira took the crown and repeated the ritual, crowning him with words of her own. "Kyle Aldrich, you have shown me that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. You have proven that the strongest hearts are those that remain open despite the risk of pain. Will you wear this crown as a symbol that we build our future on the foundation of genuine love?" "I will," he said, his voice rough with emotion. As the crown settled on his brow, both of them felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with two souls who had found their perfect match. Outside, the last light of sunset painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink, blessing their union with natural beauty. Years later, when they returned to Winterhold Castle on anniversary visits, they would always remember this moment. Two people who had thought their time for love had passed, discovering that the heart knows no seasons and recognizes no limitations save those we impose upon ourselves. The wedding crown of Winterhold had found another worthy couple to bless, and their love story would become part of the castle's legend, inspiring future generations to believe in the transformative power of love, found later than expected, but treasured all the more deeply for its unexpected arrival.